the one on a clapboard, like a...
Hello, and welcome to the Ohio Northern SERP Environmental Humanities Lab. We are an interdisciplinary group of undergraduate researchers who have developed their own independent study on the environment using humanities methods. We have been advised by Dr. Forrest Klingerman, Emily J., and Jonathan Spellman. My name is Maddie Alexander, and I am a forensic biology major, and my project has been developing a framework for evaluating the permissibility of activism in the form of property damage for the environment. Does it take mashed potatoes on a painting to make you listen? This question was raised by Mirjam Herman from the German climate activist group Last Generation after coating a painting by Monet titled Les Mules with mashed potatoes. After doing so, her and another activist from the group, both in neon orange vests, each glued a hand to the wall below the painting dripping with mashed potatoes and recited problems with our current climate, claiming, "We are in a climate catastrophe." While to many this action may seem wrong, irrelevant, and harmful to the activist cause, the video garnered hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube as well as viewership from the multiple news sites the activists posted on, including popular outlets such as the New York Times, NBC News, The Guardian, CNBC, Fox News, and many more. That being said, while the painting was not damaged due to the protective barrier covering it while on display, many find it hard to believe risking damaging a $110 million painting is worth the benefits that protesting in this manner can provide. And, even if this is the case, are the activists' actions justified given their acts generate a positive utility? What if they don't do so? Are there any other factors that affect the permissibility of their actions? Many philosophers focused on environmental activism have looked at similar cases to this one, including releasing minks from a mink farm in Van Wert, Ohio, splashing tomato soup on Van Gogh's sunflowers, vandalizing M25 gas stations with hammers and spray paint, setting fire to the Dakota Access Oil Pipeline's construction area, and burning down or knocking over hunting towers. They aim to propose a framework for cases of property damage for the sake of the environment that can answer the question of whether these acts are justifiable. Some, like Gregory Bassam and Derek Turner, are doubtful that such a framework can ever prove these cases to be permissible, while others, like Michael Martin and Thomas Young, believe that, while not yet identified, a proper framework can justify some acts of property damage. I also believe that not all acts of property damage for the environment are morally wrong, and came up with a list of necessary principles that can evaluate individual cases of the category of activism. Based on these principles, the case of throwing mashed potatoes at Monet's $110 million painting is actually morally permissible, along with releasing minks from a mink farm in Ohio, splashing tomato soup at a painting by Van Gogh, and many other acts. After reviewing many cases of property damage for the environment, like those I've already mentioned, I broke down each individual act into the factors that made it up and looked at which ones affected the deontological category the act falls into. I then isolated factors that appear across many cases of activism and included them as necessary principles in my framework. My framework reads as follows. Principle 1. Causing harm to others is permissible in some scenarios. Principle 2. Harm caused cannot be unnecessary. Principle 3. Objective risks of harm must be minimized. And Principle 4. Harm can only be performed if it yields a net positive expected effectiveness. The activists from Last Generation who vandalized Monet's painting were justified in their action for all of the following reasons. They did not engage in any physical or mental harm of life. They chose to use mashed potatoes over a substance that could objectively risk harming someone, such as a product containing common allergens such as peanuts or tree nuts. There was a net positive expected effectiveness while excluding the protesters from the calculation due to self-sacrifice, since the only negatives that came from the protest were having to clean mashed potatoes off the glass, while the positive effects could be as great as contributing to stopping climate change, which would benefit millions of people in non-human life. Due to this act of property damage for the sake of the environment and abiding by all necessary principles, the activists were sufficiently justified in this protest. This framework can be applied in a similar manner to most acts of this category of activism, excluding those that involve physical harm to people or those that involve extraneous factors. Having this framework allows for new and important conversations to be had between activists to make sure they are able to effectively protest while being mindful of their responsibilities to others.
So your project focuses on activism in the environment, so like in your paper or just for you personally, like how do you define environment?
Okay, I think so that going through this process has really allowed me to connect more with the environment and see it more as a community of living beings who essentially work together and evolve off of each other. And looking at different cases of activism, the activists are trying to see the environment and different animals as their equals rather than being like above them and being able to treat them as objects, because a lot of the reason why, especially with animal liberation, why it's defined as property damage by a lot of people is because they consider animals and like living beings to be objects rather than subjects. And I think that's really a problem. So I think that the environment is consistent of subjects that evolve off each other, us included. I think we're part of the environment and we have an obligation to like rely on other beings, not just ourselves, and treat them with respect.
So that what you had said about animals being kind of viewed as property, really, that kind of leads into my question. And so, what factors, especially ethically, do you think really affect people's perception and then therefore action towards the environment?
I feel like if they just how they see, I know perception is how you see it, but if you can relate to the environment and you can see that really we're all just cells that form different systems, like obviously like the central dogma of biology, like everything builds upon each other, and biologically, other than like DNA and stuff, we're really no different than any other organism. So if you can recognize that and see that we're not above any of these other things and like view them as not necessarily as people but with the same respect of people, then we'll be able to have a better understanding for them, relate to them more, and treat them with the respect that they deserve as subjects and living beings.
That does sort of build upon really well how you've been defining environment for this project.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I would like to ask, what areas of further research have you identified? Where could this project go from here?
So there's a lot of different areas. I think definitely perception on the environment plays a huge role, especially with how activists affect perception onto the environment. Also, one of the big problems with my project, well, not problems, but area that I didn't really address is how to calculate effectiveness and exactly how to define it. I gave a rough definition, but I feel like more should be dug into effectiveness. And in my project, I assumed that effects on humans are equal to effects on animals, but I want to know more about why exactly that is, and just further research to weigh the cons and pros of everything.
And then kind of looking at your research as a whole, like what's been your biggest takeaway or just even like your favorite part of conducting your project as a whole?
I liked reading all the different cases of activism and learning more, because some of the things like I never knew, like I didn't even know that there were such things as hunting towers. I thought people just went out with their rifles. I didn't know that they got in towers and shot animals, but even learning about that was interesting. But definitely the biggest takeaway is probably like a greater appreciation for nature. I think coming to college as a whole has allowed me to go outside more and be able to recognize more beings, especially with labs and stuff that I've done. And biology and other classes has been helpful. Also, the only other like humanities class I've taken has been environmental ethics, which was a really helpful class for me to also learn more about the environment and have a better appreciation for it. And I feel like in the future I want to be a medical examiner, so there's not going to be much room for interdisciplinary studies. So I feel like doing this now before I in my career I'm not able to do it in college is going to be helpful for me to develop this skill of being able to look at different things and apply things from each and then come together and derive knowledge off of that. Thank you for listening, and please tune in next week for Maggie's presentation on faith in the environment. Go Bears!